Thum Brackari were approaching. He didn't need visuals to know that. He could feel them. Archie Moore's breath rattled through the cracked seal of his helmet. Each inhale strained, wet. His visor was fractured, half his field of vision blurred by blood, dirt, and static. He couldn't move his left arm. It hung limp across his chest plate, cracked at the forearm and twisted at the elbow. Pain pulsed sharp, then dull, matching the tremor beneath him. What remained of the Delta Squadron lay scattered between the ruins of the western compound and the collapsed barricade on the ridge. The detonation had ended seconds ago, but the dust still clung to the air like it refused to leave. Smoke curled in slow spirals above the craters, drifting over scorched metal and bodies that no longer moved. Fragments of armor plates and scorched visors littered the battlefield like broken promises. He shifted his head just enough to peer past a slab of scorched concrete. The Brackari came into view, three of them moving as a line of blackened bronze towering over 2 meters. Each wore curved armor of obsidian plates laced with molten gold etchings, powered by a lattice of blue kinetic tubing that pulsed with each step. Their skin, or what passed for it, was ridged charcoal gray and segmented like insect chitin. Faces hidden behind smooth masks of mirrored obsidian, reflecting the battlefield like death was studying its own handiwork. Moore had seen them in training briefings. Never expected to hear them this close. Last known signal still active. Verify, repeat. All Delta units presumed KIA initiating red protocol. The voice cut through the static in his comms. Major Harland, precise as always, his tone cold, firm. Cadet Moore, if you are receiving this transmission, acknowledge immediately. He didn't respond. Enemy forces have full visual control. You are in hostile territory. You are not to engage. Protocol Sigma 7. Power down your beacon. Transmit confirmation of surrender. You are carrying classified engineering schematics. They cannot fall into enemy hands. Moore blinked. The comm crackled again, then went quiet. Thum, more footsteps, closer now. The Brackari squad had spread, sweeping the perimeter. One of them stopped within 10 meters, turning to examine a mangled heap of metal that had once been a turret housing. Moore didn't move, he barely breathed. The pain in his arm was rising now, spreading up his shoulder, but he couldn't afford to cry out. He bit his lip until he tasted copper. Another sound, a low hum above, engine rotations in an unfamiliar frequency. Moore risked a glance upward. 4 Brackari dropships hovered in a V formation, the blue burn of their gravity stabilizers churning up ash and dirt. They were positioning in orbit around the base's central tower. He had seen this before. They weren't just claiming territory. They were staging something, a trap. Moore's stomach twisted. If he followed the order, activated the surrender protocol, keyed the transponder, extraction would be impossible. The Brackari were waiting to use his signal like bait, and the squad sent to retrieve him would never see the ambush coming. The schematics in his data core weren't just classified. They held the layout of Juno 9's subterranean infrastructure, terraform controls, defensive junctions, energy routing lines. Nobody else knew the system. He did. 4 weeks ago, he'd been elbow-deep in those tunnels with Senior Tech Officer Delaney, patching conduits, crawling vents, realigning half-dead stabilizers. They called it a punishment rotation for low scores. They had no idea it would save his life. His lips cracked open. "If I surrender," he whispered, the words sticking in his throat, "everyone dies." A pause. Moore stared at the interface, each option blinking like a countdown. Biosignal lock. Distress beacon. Location ping. Each one a beacon to death. His thumb hovered. No, he cut the signal. The comms died instantly, and the silence inside his helmet felt heavier than any order. Not surrender, not escape, just war now on his terms. Above him, the Brackari patrol moved on. Their footfalls receded toward the central tower, toward control points and comm relays and launch bays they thought were theirs now. Moore let out a slow exhale, pain flaring with the movement. The world tilted sideways. He had to move. With a grunt that nearly made him black out, he pulled his legs inward and twisted, dragging himself out from beneath the mangled chassis of a personnel crawler. Dust fell off his back plate in chunks. He pushed with one leg, then the other, scraping his body along the dirt until he reached a narrow maintenance hatch partially buried under rubble. It was small, rusted, barely visible from above. His good hand fumbled for the side panel, fingers slipping against the emergency lever. He tried again and again. Finally, it gave a sharp click and the lock disengaged. A hiss of pressure, a scent of burnt ozone, the hatch creaked open. Moore slid inside, vanishing into the earth. The hatch sealed behind him with a dull thud, swallowed by dust and debris as if it had never been there. Darkness took him whole. No sound, no light, just the crawl space and the war he was about to become. From above, the world thought he was gone. Below, he was just getting started. Above, the Brackari continued their march, unaware that their victory had come with an asterisk. And below, buried in shadow and agony, a cadet who just decided that surrender wasn't in his vocabulary started crawling toward the one place on that cursed base he could still call home, the underlevels where the real war was about to begin. The hatch sealed behind him with a hiss that faded into nothing, leaving Archie Moore alone in the bowels of the base. The air was thick with metal dust and coolant residue. His boots scraped against the grated floor as he crawled forward, one arm dragging uselessly at his side, the other guiding him down the narrow, claustrophobic maintenance tunnel. Darkness pressed in from all directions. He tapped his wrist module. The emergency interface flickered, damaged but functional. He switched to local override and engaged auxiliary tunnel lighting. A weak amber glow pulsed ahead, casting long shadows on rusted pipes and flickering cable lines. Moore paused, pressed his back against the cold wall, and listened. No footsteps, no comms, just the quiet hum of old systems not meant to run this long. He shifted his body with effort, reaching into the tool satchel at his belt. From the stitched pouch, he pulled a manual override key and a half-cracked tablet, one of the analog backups kept in case of total network failure. He tapped in a diagnostic ping, no uplink. He was off the grid now, exactly where he needed to be. He pushed forward inch by inch, through a service shaft lined with tangled wires and decaying insulation. Every meter hurt. His broken arm throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but he moved. At a junction node, Moore paused and rotated a junction plate off its rusted mounts. He disconnected a burnt fuse line and rewired the path manually, redirecting power away from the outer base perimeter. As the new circuit sparked to life, he traced the wall with his fingers, eyes narrowing at a faded maintenance tag barely visible under the grime. Sublayer 3C Origin Core Access off-level D good. He turned left. The tunnel widened into a half-collapsed subcorridor. Shattered light panels hung loose above his head, swaying with every distant impact. He skirted the edge of a fractured floor panel and ducked under a bent steel beam, the sharp edges inches from his faceplate. Flash memory overtook him without warning. 3 weeks ago, he'd crouched in this same tunnel, elbow deep in a faulty coolant relay while Senior Tech Officer Delaney barked instructions through his headset. Moore, that bypass won't hold if you run both junctions through it. Split the feed, stabilize the current, then test load capacity. He had done it online. Delaney had just grunted in approval. No congratulations, just the next task. Back then, he hated it. Now he owed Delaney his life. The memory faded. He reached a bulkhead door and keyed in a code manually. The panel didn't respond. "Come on," he muttered. He yanked the access cover loose and crossed 2 live wires with a short burst from a plasma cutter. The door opened halfway before groaning to a stop, just enough. He squeezed through and entered a room unlike any he'd seen on any standard base schematic. The walls were older, reinforced durasteel rather than plastel composite. Vents were thicker, round, and twisted like arteries around a central control cluster. Dust lay undisturbed across everything. Forgotten tech, he had found it. A control center from the first-generation Terraform team, those who'd colonized Juno 9 before it was considered strategically viable. He moved slowly through the space, brushing aside a loose cable hanging like a noose from the ceiling. Control consoles blinked weakly, some still displaying half-rendered UIs in old formatting standards. One, a rust-colored terminal near the far wall, emitted a slow, rhythmic beep. Moore approached and wiped dust from the screen. The display pulsed to life. Terraformation Defense Systems. Local node warning. System inactive. Manual override required. He scanned the remaining data logs. Most corrupted, others left half-finished. Report 342A, Lieutenant K. Bremen. Atmospheric spike triggered cyclonic collapse. Crew 2 unresponsive, requesting evac from Subsector 9. Wind shear tore the scaffolding from Sector Delta. No stable exit. Operator burn presumed dead. Transmission interrupted. Another log. 351C, Commander Jacobs. This weather system isn't just unstable, it's weaponized. They shut it down because they were scared of it, not because it failed. They didn't bury it to forget. They buried it to protect themselves from what it could do. I'm sealing access. If this record survives, we were wrong to ever touch this planet. He stared at the console, then down at his shaking hand. A decision. He could wait. Hope the Braccari didn't find the data. Let someone else clean up the mess. Maybe they'd even give him accommodation for surviving. But then he remembered the sound of the Braccari ships above, the way they moved with purpose, the way they always used bait. He remembered the voice on the comm, cold and absolute. No. He reached for the manual controls. The console resisted. The interface flickered erratically as he cycled through the bypass sequence. The system wanted remote verification, something he couldn't give it. Moore gritted his teeth and accessed the junction board under the terminal, wrenching free the circuit lock and forcing a bridge between power conduits with a salvaged strip of plating. The screen blinked again, manual command path engaged. A new set of yes or no options appeared. Activate sector wind field, activate thermal destabilizer, unlock seismic control layer. He didn't hit them yet. One mistake and the whole section could go up in plasma. The system was barely holding together. Half the modules were running on backup from decades-old capacitors. Most safety interlocks were tripped, fried, or removed outright. Nothing about it was safe, but it might be enough. He exhaled and sat down on the grated floor, his broken arm limp against his side. Sweat beaded on his forehead and the edges of his vision wavered from exhaustion. He looked at the options again. This was it. There were no reinforcements, no protocols left to follow, just this console and the storm it could unleash. Moore reached into a cracked compartment beside the control panel and pulled out a laminated paper schematic, an analog fallback for the terraforming matrix. He unfolded it carefully, tracing lines with one finger. Pressure nodes, wind tunnels, energy relays, emergency kill zones. It would take time. He'd have to access each zone manually, some in collapsed areas. The risk was lethal, the chance of success low, but he'd fought worse odds just to survive the first 5 minutes above ground. He tore the schematic in half, rolled up the section he needed, and stuffed it into the pouch at his side. Then he rose to his feet, staggered, and caught himself on the edge of the console. Step 1 was done. Now he had to make the planet bleed. He turned and disappeared down the side corridor, leaving the ancient terminal humming quietly in the dark behind him. Somewhere behind him, history stirred and braced for what came next. The first alarm wasn't sound, it was the wind. Moore stepped into a narrow corridor just as a low, unnatural howl surged through the air vents. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in under a minute, condensation beaded on the inside of his cracked visor. His breath fogged the glass as he limped forward, boots squelching on moisture-slick metal. The smell of rust had shifted, now it carried something acidic. Wrong. He glanced at the laminated schematic again. The activation of Windfield Sector 4A was supposed to produce turbulence over time, minor pressure shifts, but the climate engine, degraded and ignored for decades, had reacted like a dying animal. Instinctive, violent. Moore pulled himself into a recessed control closet and sat against the wall. His arm ached so badly he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. He reached up and snapped open the latch of his helmet just enough to spit out the blood pooled in his mouth. It hit the floor in a thin string and vanished into the grated flooring. Then came the low-frequency hum. He leaned forward. The hum wasn't from inside the base. It was from above, Bracari sensors. He pressed his back flat against the wall and killed his module's emitters. Moments later, through the narrow slit of a broken ventilation grate, he saw them pass, 2 shadows moving along the upper hall. Bracari scouts, their sensor mantles dragged behind them like folded wings, brushing the floor with a soft static hiss, their helmets flaring with biotic pulses as they scanned the corridor. They moved fast, too fast. That meant confidence. Good. He waited until the last trace of their footfalls faded, then reactivated his module and opened the auxiliary panel on the wall. Inside, he pulled a backup capacitor, a set of wire spools, and a strip of cracked iron tape. He moved fast, silent, sliding along the wall into the next service bay. This one had collapsed partially. The overhead support beam had given way weeks ago, maybe more. A pile of structural plating lay buried under broken conduit. It was perfect. Moore kneeled with effort and began unscrewing the casing of a burnt-out relay box. He connected 2 of the capacitor wires to the exposed lids and ran the remaining length beneath the loose floor panel. From a side pouch, he retrieved 3 damaged explosive cores he'd scavenged from a downed autocannon an hour earlier, warped, half-melted, but still volatile. He used iron tape to fix the first one to the floor's edge. The second he nestled under the fallen beam. The third he left unarmed. Bait. He connected all 3 to a proximity sensor wired to the capacitor's power draw, then spliced in the emergency field spark igniter he'd cannibalized from his own EVA suit. He activated the failsafe and moved fast. 1 corridor down, he doubled back through a lateral vent system and settled behind a ventilation port where the slats gave him line of sight to the kill zone. He waited. From the west, footsteps echoed, Bracari, this time 4 of them. One of them, a rank insignia on his shoulder, indicated squad leader, moved with a measured gait. His armor was darker, heavier, and bore marks of field repairs. Jagged welds, extra shielding bolted to the forearms. Their exosuits released short bursts of hydraulic pressure as they advanced. Moore's hand hovered over the trigger module. Not yet. The first 2 Bracari stepped over the pressure plate without triggering it. The third paused, eyes drawn to the deactivated core on the floor. He raised his weapon. The squad leader stepped beside him, said something in their guttural tongue, sharp consonants, layered clicks. Moore couldn't understand it, but the body language was clear, dismissive. He pressed the trigger, a whine. Then the floor under the lead Braccari gave way just enough to drop them an inch. As they shifted, the taped beam above cracked free and fell. One tried to leap clear, too slow. The core under the beam ignited first. Superheated shrapnel burst across the corridor. Then the capacitor discharged into the pooled coolant near the wall, and a surge of current blasted upward, catching the squad leader's mantle. For a second, it looked like they were being devoured by lightning. Then silence. One Braccari was still breathing, crawling, armor peeling from his back like wet bark. Moore didn't move. He watched as the soldier reached for his sidearm, then slumped. He let his last breath out slowly, shaking. Sweat ran down the inside of his collar. His body trembled from cold and fatigue, but his eyes remained fixed on the smoke rising from the corridor. The sharp scent of scorched polymer and singed flesh filled the air. They weren't invincible. They could bleed. He leaned back against the wall and let the moment sink in. Not long, just enough. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster. But he just killed 4 Braccari using 3 broken charges, scrap wire, and part of his own life support system. His mind clicked into a different mode. From now on, every footstep they took could be the last. He pushed himself up with a grunt and moved to collect what salvage he could from the bodies. One of the rifles was bent but salvageable. He dropped it into a duffel pack. The squad leader's mantle had a signal amplifier he could repurpose. He pried it loose and crushed the locator beacon beneath his boot. They still didn't know who was killing them. He liked it that way. An hour later, further inside the maintenance grid, he reached the base's mid-tier communication relays. The structure was mostly intact, though the receivers had long since been shut down. Moore climbed a ladder with his good arm, every pull burning down his spine, and reached the manual access hatch. Inside, he found exactly what he was hopping for, a hardline network junction still partially powered. He dropped his pack and sat, breathing hard. This time, no traps. He used the amplifier he'd pulled from the Braccari mantle and spliced it into the relay housing. If it worked, it would spike the Braccari's short-range comms with low-level static, just enough to cause lag between relay stations and introduce delay in squad coordination. Not a full block, just enough confusion. He activated the loop. A soft buzz confirmed it. Glitches were spreading through their net. He slumped against the wall again, his stomach cramped from hunger. Blood still trickled from the gash in his side where his armor plate had cracked. He was shaking again, but this time from inside, adrenaline dumping all at once. As he stood and gathered his tools, a sudden tremor shook the corridor. Dust fell from the ceiling. From somewhere distant in the base, a loud metallic screech echoed like something ancient stirring to life. The first wave was coming. Windfield activation had started to cascade. The base was breathing again. He smiled through the blood on his lips. Let them come. A concussive pulse from a distant vent collapse rattled the ducts above Moore's head. He didn't flinch. He'd triggered it an hour ago through the forgotten service crawl behind reactor Bay Theta. He braced himself against the wall with his shoulder, steadying his weight while his good hand cradled a length of cable fused to a custom trip igniter he'd soldered from a Braccari energy clip and a cracked pressure valve. Every inch of him screamed. His side wound had reopened. His knees were raw from crawling, but pain had become background noise. Moore was no longer just surviving, he was hunting. He reached the tunnel junction and paused at the grate. Beyond it, a transit corridor stretched open toward the inner hangar. High traffic, armored, monitored. He could hear the dull metal clunk of Braccari boots on reinforced alloy. 2 patrols staggered, moving in separate vectors. Perfect. He drew a deep breath, then slid the igniter through the grate, fixing it behind the wall panel. He fed the wire beneath the floor's join line and secured the homemade charge. 2 cores wrapped in blast gel packed from recovered coolant compound beneath the loose maintenance hatch just inside the corridor. It wouldn't kill a squad leader, but it would disorient, blind, and isolate. That was all he needed. He vanished back into the service shaft just as the first Braccari patrol passed above the trap. They didn't notice the faint chemical haze rising from the floor. Their armor, lacquered in tones of bronze and dark slate, reflected static bursts from the lighting panels as they moved in formation. Their exosuits hissed softly with micro-corrections, adjusting for pressure variances and corridor slope. Moore tapped the trigger, a burst of light, then a sonic snap that cracked through the corridor like a whip. He didn't wait for the screams, he was already on the move. He crawled through the next bypass vent, emerged into an auxiliary stairwell, and began laying another charge. This one simpler, a shaped detonation plate attached to a compressed steam pipe. Once ruptured, it would flood the chamber with scalding vapor and molten debris. He slid the arming pin into place and moved to the wall console. He flipped open the panel and manually rerouted the local sensor feedback loop to delay detection by 30 seconds, just enough for him to disappear again. The map in his visor blinked twice. Alert! Seismic activity spiking in Sector 6A. Winfield 4A was cycling faster than predicted. Gusts had grown sharp enough to lift unsecured plating off walkways. Brakari logistics personnel were rerouting internal supply lines and armor deployment paths. Good and chaos bred opportunity. He navigated to an elevator shaft locked since the early stages of the war. The doors had fused, but the emergency ladder still ran along its side. He rappelled halfway down using a severed fiber optic cable, then swung into a damaged hatch leading to the outer defense control ring. Inside, the old turret systems groaned with age and neglect. Cables dangled from exposed ceilings like nerves. Dust and corrosion clung to every surface. Moore accessed the wall mount and linked his cracked tablet to the relay port. A cascade of errors flooded the display. Coolant underflow, calibration drift, capacitor decay. He bypassed them, one by one. The ancient towers came online, their auto-targeting modules blind but functional. He set them to local pattern recognition and narrowed their IFFF protocol to reject anything without a human biosignature. If the calibration drifted even slightly, the turrets would cut him down too. He didn't care. Necessary. He smiled grimly as the barrel of the first turret rotated for the first time in years and locked into standby position. A sudden tremor rattled the ceiling. Dust rained down. Another burst of atmosphere pressure swept through the corridor like a breath from the planet itself. He could almost feel the storm curling beneath the surface, waiting for permission to erupt. Back in the crawl space, Moore monitored the base's movement. Brakari deployments were shifting again. They'd pulled back from 2 northern corridors after detecting automated anomalies. They still hadn't realized they were being outmaneuvered by one dying human. Good. Brakari military doctrine relied heavily on visual cohesion, line-of-sight integrity, close unit feedback, real-time gesture-based signaling. Moore had studied the translated briefings back at Fort Ascension. They didn't trust AI or indirect tactics. Everything had to be seen, confirmed, asserted in dominance. So he'd made sure to attack from angles that broke that. He watched through a cracked security camera feed as 2 Brakari fire teams approached a secondary armory. Moore had jammed the power to the adjacent hallway light grid and positioned reflectors to distort thermal readings. The lead unit entered, staggered, alert. The door behind them slammed shut. Turret 2 opened fire. Not lethal rounds, he didn't have the power, but concussive impact enough to scatter them. The other team turned back, saw nothing, hesitated. That was the moment Moore waited for. He triggered the overpressure valve in the vent line between the 2 halls. The sudden blast of steam blanketed the room in white. Shadows flickered and split. On Brakari command channels, panic spiked. He intercepted the transmission. Jagged guttural tones burst through the channel. Brakari language, harsh, sharp, clipped syllables layered with static. One voice dominated. Moore had heard it before in intercepted field memos. Commander Veer. Cold, proud, efficient. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Denial, control, command. Another voice cut in. Faster, younger, strained, a report, a warning maybe. Veer snapped back with force as if scolding a subordinate, confident, dismissive. Moore leaned closer to the cracked screen. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't cohesion. It was friction. Let them underestimate. He continued routing ambient power from secondary subsystems to fuel one more cycle of Winfield escalation. He knew the signs. Pressure would spike. Outer seals would begin to fail. And then through the static, a new signal surfaced, encrypted but poorly. Moore rerouted it through an unused debug utility in his comms interface. Something left buried in diagnostic firmware. From there, he caught a partial auto-translation. He cleaned the signal and pushed the audio through. The Brakari weren't transmitting to each other. They were recording. Distress beacon, human survivors trapped below Sector 5, multiple wounded, requesting immediate evac, coordinates to follow. Voice was synthetic, too clean, too balanced. Moore isolated the source routing. It came from inside the Brakari command spire, a transmission not yet sent. He understood instantly they were building bait. The Brakari intended to mimic a human transmission, use a voice pattern to draw reinforcements, maybe even intercept a rescue. They were building the lie he'd chosen to survive. His jaw clenched, he copied the transmission stub to his tablet and marked the command spire for breach. They wanted to fake a voice. He'd give them something real. The override key snapped in half as Moore forced it into the corroded console. Sparks leapt across his hand. The relay hub groaned under the strain as he bypassed the final lockout. The core processor flashed red across the interface, warning of systemic overload. He ignored it. Outside the access panel, the pressure differential had already dropped 6 points. Winfield had reached Phase 3. The base's atmospheric regulators were no longer regulating anything. They were feeding chaos. Through the floor vents came the sound of screeching metal, pipes expanding, walls groaning as if under tectonic pressure. Moore felt the weight shift above him. Part of the substructure was buckling. If the load-bearing beams went, the entire southwest quadrant might go with them. He confirmed the override and pulled the release trigger. The climate engine roared to life like a wild animal snapping from sedation. Warning beacons lit across the schematic on his cracked display. Ion radiation spike, Sector 9C thermal shear detected, Level 2 ventilation grid, pressure cascade, incomplete, emergency dampers, offline. Moore stumbled back, bracing himself against the wall as the temperature in the corridor dropped 10 degrees in seconds, then rose just as fast, his visor fogged. Blood smeared the inside, seeping through the cracked seams of his armor. A groan echoed through the ceiling, then a sound like something tearing. He turned, the wall beside him ruptured. A sudden venting of pressurized air blew the door clean off its hinges, slamming it into the opposite wall. A shock wave knocked Moore off his feet and sent him skidding across the floor. He hit a support pillar and stopped, gasping. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, breathing, shaking, blinking through the blur of pain and the fuzzing static in his HUD. Then the base trembled again and he forced himself upright. He limped into the adjacent junction corridor, hand pressed to his ribs. Something was wrong. Sector 12's relay node wasn't responding. The storm had knocked it offline. If he didn't get it back, the entire climate chain would desynchronize. He'd lose the pattern. The chaos would become indiscriminate. He reached the manual ladder and started climbing. Every rung tore at his shoulder. His fingers were numb, his vision narrowing at the edges. By the time he reached the access hatch, his legs felt like stone. The hatch wouldn't open. He slammed his fist against the panel. Nothing. He gritted his teeth, pried the casing off with the edge of a snapped torque wrench, and crossed the ignition leads manually. Sparks kissed his glove. The hatch hissed, then gave. The room beyond shimmered like a furnace. Pipes along the wall hissed violently, bleeding plasma and coolant into the chamber. He could see the relay housing, but it was 10 meters across open floor, now slick with conductive fluid and glowing heat fractures. He hesitated only for a second. Then he ran into steam, sparks, and the possibility of never standing again. Halfway across, a pulse from the floor plates triggered a microshock wave. The blast lifted him clean off his feet. He landed hard, slid, and smashed into the control pillar. His vision went white. For a moment, the only thing he could hear was the sharp whine of internal suit alarms. He forced his eyes open. The relay terminal was in reach. With trembling fingers, he reached up, accessed the housing, and stabbed in the hard reset pin. Sparks lashed across his gloves and suit as the system reinitialized. He felt heat tear through the back of his glove, skin blistering instantly, but he didn't let go. The terminal beeped once, reset complete. Moore collapsed backward, breathing in short, sharp bursts. The storm outside changed pitch, no longer wild, now rhythmic. The pattern had realigned, he had control again. Through the heat haze, something moved. A Brakari squad, 5 soldiers, stormed through the southern entry. Their armor was scorched and cracked, moving erratically. One of them collapsed mid-stride, twitching as a coolant leak hissed into his open neck seal. The others spread into defensive formation. Moore rolled behind the column, drew the signal remote, and keyed Tower 4's ID. The automated turret embedded in the ceiling rotated silently, its targeting beam locked. The lead Brakari looked up a second too late. 3 concussive rounds shattered his torso plate. A second shot threw another into the far wall. The survivors scrambled, one firing blindly, another dragging his wounded comrade. Tower 5 came online and swept the hall. Seconds later, only corpses remained. Moore dropped the remote. His hands were shaking too badly to hold it. He slumped against the relay housing, breathing smoke and steam. Every movement scraped against the edges of his endurance. His cracked visor was leaking air. The backup seal hissed as it struggled to compensate. He blinked at the screen on the wall-mounted security console. A new sight, Brakari hesitating. The feed flickered, but he saw it clearly. 4 soldiers standing at a junction, weapons raised but not advancing. One shouted at the others, another turned around. They weren't organizing, they were arguing. Then came something rarer than fear. One of them dropped his rifle. Moore stared. Brakari didn't retreat, didn't question. But these weren't elite units. These were soldiers who just watched their squads vanish into smoke, lightning, and screams. He scrubbed back the footage, watched again. The last one in line looked back before following. His helmet turned slowly, scanning the corridor behind him, not the posture of hunters, the posture of prey. There was no satisfaction in the image, no comfort, just proof that they were breaking. He pulled himself upright and staggered to the outer viewport node. The reinforced glass had fogged, but he could still see out into the courtyard through the cracks. The air shimmered, Thin arcs of radiation flicked like blades across the open field. Torn banners flapped uselessly against slagged steel. The Braccari had dug in. They'd built trenches, makeshift bunkers. Some were still moving, repositioning turrets, dragging wounded. He tapped the next turret sequence. Tower 6, southeast quadrant. It whined to life, then locked on. A beam shot across the field, precise and lethal. It tore through a comms repeater and vaporized the squad near it. Braccari scrambled. No coordination, no counterfire, just panic. He triggered Tower 7. Another precision strike. A fuel tank went up and flames spilled into the trench network like liquid light. Moore could barely stand. His legs gave and he dropped to his knees, vision flickering. The storm roared outside. The air inside the chamber was heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. He coughed blood, wiped his mouth, and crawled toward the edge of the console. He pressed one more command into the panel, hand trembling. Pressure spike. Layer 9, time to detonate. He leaned against the bulkhead and let the world tilt. Voices crackled through the damaged relay. Braccari screaming, some in command tones, others raw with something worse. They weren't fighting now, they were fleeing. No pride left, no anger. Only the sound of boots pounding the floor in retreat and the silence that followed, lungs burning, world screaming, storm still roaring. The cadet who wouldn't surrender dropped into the dark. The scout ship dropped from high altitude with its sensors darkened and thrusters cooled. Standard recon insertion profile. It sliced into the upper atmosphere of Juno 9's southern hemisphere, gliding through radiation plumes and storm bands so thick the clouds glittered with ionized dust. The pilot, Lieutenant Anderstone, squinted at the rising thermal interference on his heads-up display. Command, this is Echo 21. I have visual on the target zone. Atmospheric densities off the charts. Turbulence is weight, the forward sensor array screamed. A bolt of energy surged up from the ground without warning, narrowly missing the hull by meters. Shields flared white, warning klaxons burst across the cockpit. Missile lock, Type G coil gun signature. It's automated, I'm hit. I'm hit but gliding, pulling up, pulling out. Stone yanked the controls. The recon ship's aft plating peeled under the impact shock, but the stabilizers held long enough for him to burn altitude and vanish into cloud cover. Back on the bridge of the UHS Resolute, Admiral Royce Tanaka stood motionless as the data streamed in. His weathered face remained unreadable, but the officers around him flinched as the feed stuttered, showing the near-miss frame by frame. The tactical officer, Major Eli Barrett, leaned forward. "Sir, look at the heat map." The screen shimmered. Atmospheric models projected a spiraling system of radiation flares, barometric collapses, and isolated shock zones. Tanaka narrowed his eyes. That's not natural. Barrett tapped in an overlay. There, those storm corridors, each one has a delay pattern, intermittent bursts, directional containment. That's not chaos, that's planning. The science officer, Dr. Nadia Renner, stepped forward from the back console, adjusting the calibration. It's terraformation code, old protocol, military grade. Juno 9's core systems couldn't run that on their own. Not anymore, someone's doing this manually. Tanaka's voice was low, human. Renner nodded once. It's a signature. The Admiral turned toward the comms officer. Send a signal, shortwave burst only, encoded in old Earth Fleet binary, make it simple. Aye, sir, what message? He thought for a second. Then if someone's down there, they already know what they're doing, just tell them we're coming. Below, deep inside the base, Moore stirred. His eyes opened slowly, pressure slammed into his ears. The storm above was reshaping air pressure in the lower sectors. Every breath felt like it had to be earned. The console beside him flickered, struggling to stay online. The relay caught the transmission fragment before it collapsed. A line of audio cut through static. If anyone's there, keep going, we're on our way. Moore didn't move for several seconds, just listened. Then with effort, he rolled onto his side. Blood stained the floor beneath him, but his hand found the edge of the console. He pulled himself up, trembling. His ribs screamed, his knees buckled, but he stood. The message repeated once, then cut off. He exhaled, not relief, focus. They were coming, but not yet. He turned back toward the defense systems. A command panel still blinked, weak but functional. Tower 8 was still offline. He keyed in the manual calibration sequence and forced the override. The barrel above the northeast trench lock whined and rotated into position. Outside, Braccari movement had changed. The enemy was no longer advancing. They were moving laterally, trying to regroup near the outer edges where wind shear and M pulses were weakest. Retreat corridors. Moore studied the map, blinking blood out of his eyes. He saw the pattern. They were falling back, trying to escape. He wasn't going to let them. He rerouted pressure valves along Corridor Delta and opened all secondary exhaust gates.